Yeah. It just says I am the host now. So, yes, it is. It is recording already. Yes. You want me to put it on pause? Okay.
And I will try and let people in as we see them. Yes, whoever's Mr. iPad, if you could stop your video, that would be great. There's a button at the bottom of the screen to do that. All right, Evan, I think we'll get going. You still look like you're recording okay on your side?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'll let everybody in a few minutes. If I see anybody else that still needs to get in, I will allow them into the meeting. This is Dave DeMarco. Good evening again to everyone. Our program this evening is co-sponsored by the Friends of Peebles Island and Shenandoah Neighbors Connecting. The Friends of Peebles Island is an organization of volunteers that supports and promotes activities at Peebles Island State Park. Most people visit Peebles Island for its wonderful views and wildlife, but the island also has a rich history, which we'll learn a little bit about this evening. The Friends Group offers programs such as a first day hike on New Year's Day, which everyone is invited to join, a Children's Day in April, and a park cleanup day in early May. Shenandoah Neighbors Connecting is a village serving persons 55 and older who live in southern Saratoga County. Shen Neighbors' mission is to help ensure that local older adults can continue to live independently in their own homes for as long as possible. To do this, Shen Neighbors sponsors educational and social programs that keep members engaged in the community and partners with CareLinks, which provides seniors with transportation and other services they may need to remain at home. I'll email everyone after the program with the contact information for these organizations and our speaker. If you have questions during the session, please use the text box to submit your question to everyone or directly to me, Dave DeMarco. We'll respond to these questions at the end of the program. So let's get going. Evan Pritchard, who will be our presenter this evening, will help us reconstruct what life on Peebles Island might have been like 400 years ago when Mohicans considered it one of their 3 castle islands in the Mohican Nituck, or as we know it now, the Hudson River, and perhaps one of their capitals as well. Evan will look at the plants, animals, birds, fish, trees, and the lay of the land from an Algonquin perspective to reveal the hidden significance of the island. Evan is of Mi'kmaq descent. He has been doing field interviews with Native American elders since 1990 and has been the director of the Center for Algonquin Culture for the last 24 years. A lecturer on Native Studies at Vassar, Pace, Marist, Columbia, SUNY, John Jay, the University of Ontario, UMass, and Ramapo State, quite a list. He has also presented at Gracie Mansion in New York, the American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, and also online. This past October 16th, he presented a retrospective of his work at the Beacon Institute for Rivers. He has written over 50 books on Native culture, history, and spirituality, including Native New Yorkers, Henry Hudson and the Algonquins, Bird Medicine, Native American Stories of the Sacred, and No Word for Time. Evan has lectured frequently on the Way of the Huron, a body of traditional Algonquin knowledge about conflict resolution and trust building. He has published many original maps of Native American settlements in the Hudson Valley and was featured in Ted Timrick's film, Hidden Landscapes. He has appeared on dozens of radio stations and appeared as a featured guest on CNN, ABC, the Discovery Channel, History Channel, and on Roger Hernandez's 90-minute special, Touring Native New York, on the Manhattan cable. So at this time, I'm very pleased to turn the evening over to Evan.
Okay, well, thank you. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for coming. Can you hear me? I'm going to do some basic tests here. All right, we're good. Now, I have a kind of a packed PowerPoint with lots of tidbits that you may not know. So I want to kind of get started with that. And I want to make sure that I can show it. Oh, okay. So it's disabled screen sharing. So in order to show that PowerPoint, I have to be host, right?
Let's try this. You should be able to try sharing now, Evan.
Can you see?
Yep, it's coming up.
All right. Okay, so we're going to do slideshow. So yes, so since I've already been introduced, I'll go right into my program. I have done a lot of research on Peebles Island from many different perspectives. So there's a lot to go over. We are recording, and so I may go a little fast, but you know, the recording could be available, right, to viewers, David?
Yes, it will.
Okay, so might go a little fast if you miss anything. You know, we have the Q&A and then the recording. So Peebles Island from an Algonquin perspective, of course, from an Algonquin perspective, it's not called Peebles Island. It's monument, and the significance is great and a very notable place. And I'm going to try to see if this, now this is an old map. I'm going to want to minimize the screen. Okay, this is dated 1632. The map, as you can see, is not very accurate because the islands, unless the islands moved greatly, it's possible. But the island at the mouth of the Mohawk River up here where the green arrow is would be Peebles Island. So this is where it starts in terms of the contact period. Now, this is a reconstruction from a kiosk of what a wigwam would have looked like on the edge of the island overlooking the bluff into the river. And at first, it might not seem like there's much left of Algonquin culture, but one only need untangle some of the strands and then much can be revealed. So I'm going to try to untangle a bunch of strands, and bear with me if it gets complicated. So I thought I'd start with reviewing what started all my previous talk in Schenectady, I believe it was, about the 3 floating castles. And I'm going to just go over this very lightly. So I'm doing these. They end up, the south is the first, the most important. So we'll go with, start with the top with number 4, the Schaghticoke. Not really a group of Mohicans exactly, but they fled Albany in 1628 and settled near Schaghticoke Hill, and then recognized in Connecticut as a nation, and moved to the confluence of the Hudson and the Hoosick, which is near Stillwater. Okay, group 3 is what we're talking about today. We're just going to take one of these 3 today, but group 3 is in purple here, and that's Monomin's area, Monomin's Island, and the chief named himself after the island, by the way, at Peebles Island in 1627. But many accounts show Monomin being killed in the battle in 1626. So history is like that. They moved to Half Moon in 1633. Now, as I will be showing you, Monomin means Berry Island, and this is Peebles Island, its original native name. Now, that is our key interest today, that purple area and how they moved around in this area. Group 2 to the south is led by Unawak, and he was at Nassau Island in 1623, also at Fort Orange, which is not far away. His name Unawak probably derived from Onawak or sky. In other words, his name was either sky or heaven, but in the Algonquin idea of a great light. So his name has to do with sky, meaning maybe he's has very expansive vision. And that's also like the direction of the father sky. So he's fatherly. So the arrow is here, the green arrow, Papscani Island, where Mohicans are repatriating the land at the Papscani village. But that was originally sold to Rensselaer in April 13 of 1637. That's this area in between the purple and the green. Now down at the bottom in the south, we have group 1, which is called the Mohican proper. and that's led by Apechen, which is little ape in Dutch, but his original Mohican name was Escoyas. I don't have a translation, but he was the leader of all of these 3 floating castles. And I say they're floating because they're floating sort of like volunteers. You know, they're here for a while, they do a job, and then the whole village moves on somewhere else. It's pretty amazing. Stays intact, in fact. So at Castleton or Skodak in 1609. In 1660, part of his group moves to the Catskills, and part of it stays put. Skodak means where the smoke rises, suggesting a place of peacemaking where fires are not hidden. In other words, they have no enemies. So they have open fires. In a wartime, you cover your fire, don't let the smoke out. So then he was replaced by Hendrik Appelmuth, probably meaning intellectually strong testament. So that's a quick review of that. Now, going back, group 4 is at the north of the top. The Scaticoke are joined by some Pocumtucks in 1676, fleeing massacres in Massachusetts, mostly at Taunton, which is a very famous one, July 4th, 1676. In 1698, they're joined by Mohicans from Half Moon, and some Mohicans begin to move to Odenak, which is, of course, way up north on the Vermont border, and Becancour is still a thriving Algonquin cultural center. Now, group 3, this is us. This is Monoman's Berry Island group. In 1633, they moved to Half Moon, as I mentioned. In 1698, some moved from Half Moon to Scaticoke. So some of the original people from Monoman's Island and surrounding areas may be members of the Scaticoke community today. Group 2, further south, Unawats or Skies Village, was opposite Fort Orange before 1623. Some moved to Troy, to the Puston Kill and the Hudson. And the Puston Kill and the Hudson are still there. Troy's still there. So that's where they moved. But then that was 1623. Then they left Fort Orange area in 1624, and most moved to Cohoes. So they're consolidating in 1650. And again, the green arrow is Pupscotty Village. Now, group 1, which is, remember, the principal village, that's Apechen's village, Escoyas, village of Skodak, offshoot village at Catskill. But then in 1680, both groups unite at Menands, south of Unawat's group. So what's happening is they're starting to consolidate a solid line on the west side of the Hudson, which you may have thought was Mohican or Iroquois or Haudenosaunee on the west side. But here in this mid 1600s, the Mohicans are creating a solid line of settlements all up and down the west shore of the Hudson in the Albany area, as you see in this map. So this is stage 2. In 1680, well, maybe stage 3, 1680, both of his groups, of Apechen's groups, reunite at Menands. And remember, Unawat's now in Cohoes. And that's now south of Monoman's group in Half Moon. See, so they're all in motion, but they're moving in concert. Large numbers of people all getting up and moving together to another spot, but in concert with other villages also moving. It's phenomenal. It's quite something. And there's other Mohicans elsewhere, of course, who are under the leadership of these 3 islands. Monoman's group is joined from Mohicans, the Scaticoke, and all 4 castles in a small area stretching along the west bank around from Route 20 in the south to Mechanicsville in the north, only 21 miles. So it's pretty phenomenal. So this group forms a united front along the Hudson, but from 1703 to the Revolutionary War, Mohicans continue head to Odenak and Becancour, but also east to Westonhock, which is now Stockbridge, as you know, and west to places like Onaquaga, Siningo, out near the Susquehanna or on the Susquehanna. So Onaquaga literally means, in Mohican, means evening or night. And it's interesting that it's in the west and where the sunset is. So there may be some poetic intention. Some Mohicans align with the Oneida, and hence they ended up in Oneida, Wisconsin, Bowler, Wisconsin, and other settlements. So I know it's kind of hard to absorb all this, but this is the background. And then, of course, there in red is Niskayuna, incorporated 1809. It has a Mohawk name based on patents with Dutch settlers. And so there's planting fields and hunting grounds of Monomans and Unawats people, very, very close to that of the Mohawks at Niskayuna. But they're divided by the Pine Barrens, which runs through where the green arrow is. And the Pine Barrens include lots of wetlands, so that there's a substantial barrier between these two cultures who are not always at peace. Sometimes, yes, through diplomacy, and sometimes there's conflicts. So the waterways and the pine barrens keep them separate. So it's only, see how close they are. That's less, I think, a few miles at the very most. So then again, Mohawks, 3 clans similar to Mohawk: bear, wolf, and turtle. So the bear is Mukwa, wolf Mekhahu, and turtle Tunpahu. I'm not, fluent in Mohican. So in Stockbridge, clans were Muncie, same as Muncie. They were turkey, wolf, and turtle. And clans were based on location as well as the matrilineal descent. But all 3, according to Iroquois, which is one of my sources, all 3 sachems were bear clan. So this is really getting into the local area here. In the upper left is the drawings were made at the time of the Cohoes Mastodon bones, published in Harper's Weekly. The Cohoes Mastodon was found at the base of Cohoes Falls, which is west of Peebles Island, not shown. Bones have been swept into a large pothole, which is used by sturgeon during low tide and low water levels in the summer. The road from Albany to Montreal, marked on the map, you see it's marked road from Albany to Montreal here, crosses from Waterford over across Peebles Island into Van Schaik's Island and on south. This is typical of mastodon trails from about 9,000 BC. When they stampede, they make a wide trail in minutes, just like elephants do today, becomes an animal trail and then a Native American one. The mastodon trails follow large rivers such as the Hudson here, and it tends to be level near the Hudson, so they would prefer that. The females lead the pods. They instinctively know the safe place to cross, and usually that's an island such as Peebles. The trail is a branch of the one marked Route 9 and Route 32, still heads from New York City to Montreal. And Ritchie, that's William A. Ritchie, the state archaeologist, mentions that there was a trail from the southeast corner of the Mohawk River, which is fairly near the falls, down south to Steamboat Square in Albany, which is still in existence between Broadway and Route 32 at about 4th Avenue. And so that's part of where part of this trail goes. It would follow 32, which pretty much follows Broadway some places very closely, and then splits off. And then there's Green Street goes right through the middle of Steamboat Square, which is not so much a square anymore. But I want to note out, if you look at the feet of the mastodon, these feet in water stretch downwards and become paddles. It's a phenomenal thing. I mean, obviously they lived a long time ago, but elephants do the same thing. But the mastodon's feet seem to be even more paddle-like. So when they're swimming, their feet become these large paddles like a steamboat. So they're okay in the water. Now the sturgeon, some people have found sturgeon bones and sturgeon swimming in those potholes. Sturgeon cannot be out of the water for long. So in the summer they head for the potholes, and there's a example of a sturgeon. So then, of course, there's the story of the peacemaker. I'm not supposed to say his name. This is from this picture is by John Fadden. The book is The White Roots of Peace, the Iroquois Book of Life by Paul Wallace, one of my favorite authors. And he writes, he climbed the tree to the topmost branch, and then Mohawks cut the tree down so that it fell over the cliff into the water. The people watched to see if he came up, but there was no sign of him. Quote, "Let us return at sunrise," said the chief warrior, and the people went back to their village for the night. The next morning before sunrise, a man with the Kanienga, which would be a village, coming to the place by the falls where the tree had fallen, saw a little distance across the cornfields a column of smoke rising, and going toward it, he saw a man seated by his fire, and it was the peacemaker. When the man returned to the village and told what he had seen, the people came out and brought Dinwiddie back to the place of council. The chief warrior spoke. He said, "Yesterday I was in great doubt, for words, however good, do not always betoken the thing it is. Now I am in doubt no longer. This is a great man who reveals to us the mind of the master of life. Let us accept his message. Let us take hold of the good news of peace and power." So of course, that became the whole process that led to the US Constitution and other things, many other things. and the Great Law and the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee Longhouse. The Huron peacemaker may have aimed for this large pothole as he dived from the felled pine tree in the story of the Great Law, perhaps hid there holding his breath during this test. And in one oral tradition, he's seen in the next morning cooking fish and eating it. So was it the sturgeon that he ate? I do not know. So now this is something I wanted to point out if you haven't thought of it. Mohicans considered the Mohicanatuck or Hudson River their home, but the Haudenosaunee, led by the local Mohawk, needed access to marine life, which is only accessible in the Hudson via the Mohawk River because they have a large waterfall there. Monoman was right at the boundary between the two civilizations, or the Iroquoian one, a white term, and the Algonquin one, also a white term. Most of the time, peace was maintained through diplomacy, but once in a while, conflict flares up. Chief Monoman, a great warrior, died in battle at the hands of Mohawks in the battle, which was either 1624, or that should be 1626, that's a typo, 1626. He was defending the entire Mohican territory, for which all practical purposes was a confederacy of loosely joined council fires and sacgemdoms that really stretched at times to the Connecticut River. That battle was one of the first Mohican-Mohawk conflicts known to the contemporary Europeans, but there were many more to follow. And during the next 150 or so years of intermittent warfare with the Mohawks, much of it manipulated by Dutch, French, and English power struggles, each of the three castles, the floating castles, moved several times, remaining completely intact with their villages in tow. So in order to understand the importance of Monoman, he didn't live long during the historical period. And a few years after he was kind of discovered by Henry Hudson and some Dutch, then he died in battle. But he knew that he was defending the entire Mohican frontier, if possible, flare-ups with the Haudenosaunee. So meadowwood projectile points are found on the island, and that's very, very significant. And here on the right, you see a red area where meadowwood has spread, and you see it kind of diminishes in intensity, even in Ohio and Michigan, but in Pennsylvania, New York, it's very, very prevalent, and all the way into Massachusetts. So this is, I didn't get a photo of the broken meadowwood projectile point from Peebles Island, but this is a complete one that looked very similar, I believe. And the other one broken may have been a killed spear, which means it was broken in ceremony during a burial ceremony, so that the spirit of the spear could rise up to the spirit world with the departed. So it was found at Peebles Island. So what secrets does it reveal? So Ritchie based on carbon-14 on an early date, 2444 BC for the beginning of meadowwood culture, but widespread by 1300 and ending at 700 BC. So this is transitional into the early woodlands, which is usually marked 1000. The sample was dated 2400 BC, but that might be too early. The meadowwood points are made from Onondaga chert and from rhyolite, which is more widespread. They descend from Laurentians, which are, it's an archaeological term, but these are Algonquin speakers, directly from an Anderson site on the western portion of the Laurentian field or Great Lakes. They were part of the red ochre culture that included Orient Point. So this is a very distinct culture, which any Algonquin will tell you were our ancestors. They go straight through. They used red ochre, limonite, and graphite as body paint to strengthen immune systems for renewal. So the dead were also sprinkled with it for the same reasons, so that they might be renewed. Dead were surrounded by mortuary gifts in the burial site, such as stone, copper, and there were killed pots and spear points, such as the one found at Peebles. So they had flexed, cremated, and bundle burials in deep pits, which is typical of their culture. They had large ceremonial blades and ceramic tubular or cigar-shaped smoking pipes, which replaced earlier stone ones, which is really the beginning of the whole phenomenon of smoking pipes around the world. They improved the symmetrical spear blades. They made rolled copper beads and copper awls and celts. They had 3-holed stone-carved gorgets, which are very distinctive. So the culture was distinctive in many ways. This culture expanded west as far as northern Indiana, but with diminishing influence through Ohio. And eastward, you can see a connection to the Wampanoag culture, which has the largest North American burial area in North America. And the burial was for proto-Wampanoags from 8,000 to 1,000 BC in Massachusetts. They had also red ochre and mortuary gifts. And there's a very clear comparison or similarity, and they would kind of fall into the same category at the same time. So the red paint people, however, 3,000 to 1,000 BC, was also an eastern part of the Laurentian tradition associated with maritime side of this post-Clovis development. And there was also Plano in between. So bow and arrows replaced by attle. So this is a little technical, but it's very important because the finding of meadowwood projectile point on Peebles Island is one of the most important clues to understanding the whole culture that was there at that time. It ties in with a lot of things. So I apologize if it's a little thorny. Now, Proto-Mexican culture people hesitate to name or link a language, a living language, with any archaeological pre-contact evidence. But in this case, I think Edward Curtin and a lot of people would heartily agree. It seems evident it's Mohican. And there were homogeneous society from 3000 BC stretched from the Susquehanna and further west to what is now Cape Cod. But then it contracted inward from other people, other cultures coming in. About 1000 BC, we have a transition to woodland period, and becomes meadowwood, which is the type of culture at Peebles Island. We know they were there. And this later contracts to the Mannahattack area. And here you see a map that I made of this important area. And it stretches at least 50 miles northward of this map. And meadowwood culture, in other words, the people that produced that projectile point, were at the center of this phenomenon and could be considered not only Algonquins, but in a local case, Proto-Mohican or Mohican. Several points were still being used at the time of Henry Hudson, some of the points similar to meadowwood. And this Mannahattack area is still a unified area and was referenced by the Dutch. Now I have an interesting quote here. This is Penn State University said, "Meadowwood culture seems to represent a distinctive shared belief system and an associated trade and exchange system found throughout the Middle Atlantic, Eastern Great Lakes, and Southern New England regions. The regional size of the shared belief system and the level of interaction is," I think he said, basically to say it's new in the Atlantic region compared to previous times. So that's from Penn University. So this is why I'm saying this finding of this point is very significant, because it's not only a culture, but it's one of national importance. So here's some artifacts from ceremonial burials of this meadowwood phase. And this is from the book Archaeology of New York State, which I relied on somewhat. These mortuary gifts and the keen attention to burial, consistent over a very large area, seem to indicate a unified belief system across Eastern North America about 1000 BC, just to make that clear. So those are some interesting things. And here is on the left, 13 is a clay version of the stone tubular pipe, which looks like a cigar, which is interesting because that was also another way to smoke tobacco back in the day. And this 18 is what they called this 16 is a Popeye bird, and they don't know what it's for, but you see the eyes popping out. This is very consistent throughout meadowwood culture. We don't know, I don't think anybody knows what exactly it meant, but birds are often associated with the flight of the soul. And here you have a similar projectile point, a necklace, rolled copper, and the gorget. So I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit, but there's this meadowwood culture is in a lineage that's very long. And you notice that these are, well, Clovis, of course, that Plano developed much of copper culture and made birch bark canoeing a thing. The Laurentian is a very wide sweeping culture that certainly includes the Ottawa River, where the Algonquin language seems to have been developed. Morrison's Island certainly is a great cultural center. 4000 BC, they had copper that rivaled Egypt only 1,000 years earlier. Shield culture, we only hear about not too much, but it's in Quebec, and they also developed the canoes and copper culture and the use of flint. Brewerton there are burials that are Laurentian here. Frontenac Lake is very fascinating. Union Springs, New York, and the first flourishing of river culture, which really connects to the people of Peebles Island. And the development of portages, which is, we're going to talk a little bit about. So acorns were plentiful. In 2500 BC, the Laurentians, who had, according to Ritchie, narrow heads, extended burials like we generally have today, copper, tubular stone pipes, were joined by, surprise, the Lamoka immigrants from a very different culture, round heads, flex burials, marine shell beads, and they intermarried, and offspring were also hybrid, and a new culture was also hybrid. So this is a big event in 2500 BC. And so this, again, is an immediate forerunner of Meadowood. And of course, here we have Meadowood 1000 BC transition, influenced by Frontenac. And so they're the first ceramics in the Northeast become plentiful for the first time. Now, Snook Hill, I'm going to talk about, there was settlements at Catskill Creek, at Hoosick Falls, and in Rensselaer County, connected to what's called Susquehanna material culture, with the broad spear, with the carved steatite into vessels that preserved heat. These vessels were killed in ceremonies, so there are very few left intact. Also, continuation of red ochre culture. And the Susquehanna culture is a larger group, including Snook Hill. So this is very local and yet of national importance. After that comes Edina, which is capital at Chillicothe in Ohio, but of course, from 500 BC to 100 AD, very major influence around Eastern North America. They traded with the Laurentians to the north, with today would be called Anishinaabe and Meadowood to the east. And then later on, you get Point Peninsula and Lavana, more associated with the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee. So according to Edward Curtin, one of my favorite archaeologists, he says that, Proto-Mohicans and maybe even Meadowood culture was displaced eastward by the arriving Haudenosaunee. That would be the newer part of that, who come and intermarry with the locals, Point Pleasant. The headwaters of the Delaware were Algonquin territory, according to Curtin, until 900 AD. And then the Mohican migrated east. The Munsee apparently emerged out of this confrontation, or just merging to the south. Their ceramics were influenced by the Owasco, so something was going on there with that connection. So the Schoharie Valley was shared in peace by Mohawk and Mohican starting in 1300, according to Curtin, and for a long time there was no conflict. But then the Mohicans were displaced and moved eastward around 1500. So in this map, you see Peebles Island is right at the top at the Hudson River line, right above the map. And Normanskill is this yellow area, the yellow indicating population area. So, so Meadowood has many mortuary facts. Most of what we know about them is from the burials. And these are some more. The clay tube at the bottom is the forerunner of the elbow pipe, which is used for smoking tobacco. And this is related to the cigar. It happens to look like one. But all true smoking pipes, elbow and tubular, around the world derive from North America. And the Meadowood culture is at the center of that phenomenon. So if you've ever smoked a pipe of any kind that's either an elbow pipe, like most people think of, with the bowl, or the tubular pipe, you're in debt to the Meadowood people. So this is a bare island. So I read Paul Huey's report on Peebles Islands, and he mentions that a bare island point was uncovered near the southwest point of the island. They're believed to date from the late Archaic, about 1500 to 1000 BC, although most sources I read date them as far back as 3000 BC. Mostly in the southern and eastern New York states. So this is near the northern limit of its geographic range, as Huey says. So here is one that I found at Dennings Point in Beacon, 80 miles or so to the south. This one identified in 1959 at Bear Island, Pennsylvania, hence the name. And they're very common in Maryland and along the Susquehanna River, but less common here. He also wrote, he said, a broken Vosburg point of the Archaic period was found in one area which would date to 2500 BC. And that's a kind of a cousin of the Meadowood Point. Vosburg points were very popular or plentiful at Sylvan Lake, which is right off from Fishkill Creek in Dutchess County. A Madison Point was found in another area, and there was a Levana Point, likely dating from the late woodland period. So that's very recent. And they're the triangular. So this is a map which is interesting. This is a map of, you see Monomin's castle there, and there's the island. So the island's situated at crossing places. They've always been used as a rendezvous, as the French trappers call them, and or council fire meeting places. And I call them islands of fire, and I have a book by that name, as they are parts of an ancient system of government gatherings involving foot and canoe travel. So islands would be a logical choice. Such island meeting places date back to the Clovis era, when transportation was almost always by water. But the usage of islands increased during the Frontenac Lake phase, which I mentioned before, one which directly preceded Meadowood. The Mohican consistently built castles or forts on these islands in the Hudson River, which was called the Mohicanituck, the greatest of all estuaries or arms of the sea, and tuck means tidal water that flows both ways. They named themselves after the river, which was their home. So in Algonquin culture, you wouldn't name anything after a chief, really. You would name the village after the local geography, and then you would name, and then the chief might take the name of the village. It's very common. Now, it's interesting, I want to point out that this original cursive marking is correct, Monument's Castle, and this label is actually incorrect, Monomini's, that castle, that's a Western tribe with a maybe a similar history, but the linguistics are off there. There's a Menominee nation. This is something else. Okay, so the word mon, or spelled mana or monet, it's the same sound. It's mon, that the settlers might have spelled it differently. The word berry is min in Algonquin throughout all the languages you can think of. At times it means seed or nut as well. Several Algonquin scholars I interviewed stated emphatically that Monomin means Berry Island. Of course, there was a chief, Monomin, and chiefs are often naming themselves after their village. The villages are usually named after the unique features of the land, in this case, an island of berries and nuts. As most forts, these were strategically placed with a long view of the river where the enemies might approach on boats. The castle at Monument overlooked the fording place at what is now Waterford. Is most likely was a round fort made of large 16 feet or even up to 30 feet cedar posts embedded in a berm of circular mound of dirt with a spiral opening. Some of them might have had a spiral opening where the beginning and ending of the walls were parallel, forming a hallway, and sometimes the entry was just a large gate. So this photo I took was taken near the site of the fort. The American fort built on top of Monument's Castle was still visible from the train bridge in the 1840s. Its location agrees with earlier maps showing the location of the Sachem's Castle. Now this one here, this drawing was of Maringo Man's Castle in Blooming Grove, New York, but I believe it's similar to the one that Monument had. Now this is on the right, a painting of a Mohican chief made in England during the time of Queen Anne. Her reign was only from 1702 to 1707. And I believe this is Itawak Cham, which means the older brother. And he was born 100 years later than Monument, but you can see might be possible relatives. We don't have no photos of either one, of course. Now, so the Revolutionary War redoubt, which is this dark line in the map, was located, redoubt is like a fort with breastworks, was located at the same spot as Chief Monument's fort. And the arrow points to where I believe his fort was. And George Washington knew his Indians and he knew Mohicans. He knew that the Mohican choice was the optimal one for reconnaissance. And so Gates had a long encampment here for that reason. It was ideal for watching this important travel route. Now the soil was very hard. And so the soldiers were trying to dig trenches, but it was hard to dig up the dirt. So they probably took the berm dirt and built up the front of the trenches to protect themselves, and no trace of the fort remains today. So this is a true story. I was walking all around Monuments Island with a friend of mine who happens to be an Algonquin descendant and an expert on plant medicine. I was looking all over the ground for medicinal berries, but found none. So I started to feel frustrated. I said, well, if this is Monuments Island, where are all the berries? And very calmly she answered, Well, maybe you're looking in the wrong direction, Evan. And then she gestured upwards, looked up, and then pulled down a handful of mulberries from above my head and placed them in my mouth. The mulberries are big medicine. So I knew my journey towards understanding this mysterious island was just beginning. So I'm going to skip that other part. Okay, so mulberries. So I went to a Mohican elder, Itikwa. I said, she said, I grew mulberries in Rahway, have a bush here in Pennsylvania. Very important. It counteracts the negative effects of tomatoes and potatoes, which are in the deadly nightshade family and have good and not so good components. All the dark berries were important to Mohicans. They ate them as each came into their own season, one after another, beginning with strawberries and on and on. As it turns out, they are polyphenols, extremely important for human health since early times. So this is Itikwa, and to the right, her late husband and my friend Sagamore Mike D'Amico of Mohicans, related to many Algonquin tribes. Now this is Chuck Stead. I wanted to know if science had insights on mulberries, so I contacted the esteemed Meskwaki and Mohawk PhD and environmental science professor from Ramapo State College, Chuck Stead, and he had bushels to say about mulberries, and he sure didn't learn it from a book. Chuck Stead, leaning into his Meskwaki and Mohawk ancestry and his botanical training, said, quote, red mulberry, as well as the white, was always popular as a dried fruit treat of a cooked vegetable or a cold drink or jelly, but the jelly requires the addition of pectin and therefore believed to be more of a European idea. The vegetables harvested from new leading shoots which are good to collect just as the new leaves are unfolding. But unripe fruit and raw shoots and uncooked ones can be hallucinogenic. The white mulberry was a preferred additive once dried for nut bread. Bread produced from acorn flour with the additive dried white mulberry was considered a characteristic treat throughout southern New York and all of New Jersey. He said, I ate some dried white mulberries when I was a kid, and my dad had me visiting elders near Southfield, and they were hard and difficult to chew. And they were, but I remember they were sweet and delicious if you left them in your mouth. So I'm blocked out on the last sentence. Okay, this is Chuck again, a separate conversation. Dad's name was Walter, and he learned to make mulberry wine from a Ramapo elder and put the recipe in a book, which I still have somewhere. There were several sources for lore about mulberries, and Father initialed each one to his source. So he still remembers what those initials mean in case he needs to talk to the source people. Some Ramapo claim there was fermentation before contact with whites, and many others say no. Mulberries ferment very quickly as they only stay intact for a day after picking. Our friend and forager Paul Tappenden recommends we talk to the Mohawk clan mothers about the use of mulberries as medicine. So there are several elders who believe that there was use of fermentation before contact, while others consider it a taboo subject and won't discuss it. He said, when I was a kid, I was encouraged to drink Father's mulberry wine, and it was sweet at first taste. And then there was this very tart aftertaste. Okay, so we would place a sheet on the ground beneath the bush and then shake the branches of the bush, and a great number of berries would fall to the ground just from shaking. We spread one of grandmother's bed sheets into the bush and tree and pull up the bed sheet and get a pile of mulberries in minutes. That would make grandma mad because red mulberries always leave a red stain that looks like blood, and bleach does not remove it. It stains your hands just picking them, as you see in the picture. So elders say that bear season is berry season, and go through the different berries that come up in a certain order with no gap, starting with the strawberry, so the bears never go hungry. Mulberry is a big attraction for bears. So this monument's in Madrid, Spain, and it honors the bear's interest in the European Morus nigros strains of mulberries. And this is the Morus rubra on the right. That's the American Indian medicine berry, and regarded as a high medicine. So people would come and collect them when they could find them. Now, this is Joe Bruchac. So author of 200 books and a PhD in environmental science, and he's Abenaki, lives in Mohican territory, grows lots of plants. So I called him up. And it turns out there was a day a long time ago, back in about 1969 or 70, when he was a young man. He would have been about 28. He had the good fortune to have a long conversation with a great Mohican elder, tribal historian and author Gladys Tantaquidgeon, whose dates, this is not a typo, 1899 to 2005. She had some stamina. It was from eating all those herbs and plants, but she knew a lot about mulberries. He said she must have been 70 years old, and at the peak of her fame, she had studied anthropology in her youth with Frank Speck, had been sharing her knowledge with scholars for decades. They were joined by a very young girl, Gladys's niece, Melissa, who sat and listened. Now, Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel became an assistant to her aunt Gladys and then the official medicine woman and tribal historian of the Mohegan Nation in Uncasville. She is the prolific author of many books. I believe she and I were both at the 106-year-old Gladys's burial ceremony in 2005. Joe reached 79 himself on October 16th and has a long way to go before catching up with Gladys. So he had a lot to say about mulberries. He said, red mulberries are the favorite of bears in the Northeast. They call the black bear the medicine bear because its internal systems are very similar to our own. And so they would follow the bears around, watch and observe what bears would eat, and then eat the same thing. They noticed that when the bears had diarrhea, they would eat a lot of mulberries and assume mulberries to be a good plant to eat to help with digestion when your stomach's upset. And they were correct. The mulberries also get rid of worms as well. Now, he said something interesting. The Cherokee referred to a bear's habitat where bears are likely to be found as the mulberry place. The Cherokee also note the bear's fondness for mulberries. You notice several kinds of mulberries in the picture. The Mohawks have a long particular awareness of the mulberry. Joe Bruchac says they learned it from the local Abenaki, perhaps after the arrival of the Mohawks in the area less than 1,000 years ago. And Ray Fadden, a Mohawk tribal historian, tells a story of an old man who was very sick and every day went out into the bush to gather medicine plants, one of which was the mulberry. As the days went on, he got less sick and more healthy. In the Abenaki version of the story, there came a day when he went out for the last time. The people of the village spotted him in the bushes. He looked back once, twice, 3 times, and then on the 4th time, he turned into a black bear and walked off into the trees. And here's an actual photo. Just kidding. But then he said, Joe Bruchac said, the morning cloak butterfly is fond of mulberries. And the elders say that in the spring, this butterfly will take you to the first berries if you follow it. But then, unfortunately, its larvae eat the leaves later on, so you got to be careful. But this picture on the right is, as I understand, a morning cloak butterfly. Very beautiful. So mulberries had many uses for the first peoples of Monument Island as dark dye for clothes. Of course, the color was permanent. And they cooked it into a stew to make it sweeter, and they boiled them in water to make a health drink, either hot or cold. And the blackberry, which is well known to be the last of the great berries of the year to ripen, was also boiled in the same way. And these uses are still seen, and I'll say wherever Algonquin has spoken. Now, there was a marvelous story that Joe Bruchac told me, I don't know, I guess from Abenaki, about an old Abenaki woman. For all we know, she may have lived on Monument Island, who is in the forest one day towards the end of autumn, and she's boiling blackberries to make her favorite drink before winter comes. And out of nowhere, the frost spirit, he's up on the right here, comes up and bullies her, taunting her with the time for berries is coming to an end, he says. Perhaps he then blows a cold wind in her face with his foul breath, adding to her distress and shriveling the pile of blackberries at her side. And perhaps he shrivels the entire blackberry bush. We don't know. She takes a gourd ladle from the side of the pot and scoops up some of that steaming hot blackberry tea and flings it right in its face. He runs screaming to the farthest northern part of the world to lick his wounds, and she yells, and don't come back until all the blackberries are gone from these here bushes. And he didn't. By the way, mulberry trees do not like harsh winters. Monument Island lies at the very northernmost reaches of this mulberry phenomenon. Now, each year in the Mohican Territory around Monument Island, winter would not be expected or observed until all the blackberries are gone. And then at that juncture, some elder might go and take their pemmican out of storage. This is a preserved food made with mulberries and venison meat, very compact and used on long winter hunting trips. Many native people still make pemmican today. The word is Algonquin and most clearly heard in the Cree word pimican, fat meat. You take lean deer meat, venison, for example, deer meat, and pound it into paste with fat and make it into a cake. Also, suet, fried root, and nuts are added and used for emergency energy. But mulberry is a key ingredient because according to Joseph Bruchac elders, there's a wonderful chemical reaction between the mulberry and the venison that causes them to preserve each other so neither one spoils. Only the mulberry seems to have this effect, but also possibly some say the choke cherry that's used further west. And I have had the news of this marvelous chemical reaction has been confirmed by several elders. So on the left is the choke cherries, and in the middle is the pemmican. And here's the poor deer who's going to get it so they can make the pemmican, but the fat of the deer is very important. And here's pemmican being smoked. Monument Island must have had a long and extraordinary number of mulberries each summer, as it still does today. It also has most likely always been home to a great many white-tailed deer, as it is today. One day while I was walking on the island, a doe was giving birth right on the trail. It was very dramatic. Unless I'm mistaken, the island must have been a well-known gathering spot for making pemmican hundreds of years ago. And in mid-June, when the red mulberries ripened, could have supported several camps of pemmican makers all at once, beating the deer meat and the mulberries together into paste that would never spoil. It would keep the hunters strong on long winter trips. Equally popular with Haudenosaunee and with Algonquins, these cakes would also become trade items. We'd be spread for hundreds or more miles around Monument Island by the first throes of winter. So this may have been one of the most important things to ever happen at Peebles Island before contact. Would have been this whole huge network of pemmican. It's very important to for our native people in the East surviving the wintertime. Can't do it without pemmican. So also, surprisingly enough, the young white berry, being very toxic, as are the stems and barks, has a certain purpose. And certain Medawin or Medewin, who are the Algonquin medicine people, would eat white berries in just the right amount so they would not die, because they are poisonous, but they also had a spotter or somebody watching them to make sure they didn't die. And these Bohoan or shamans would then go on long journeys in the spirit world while awake to see the future, to bring back prophecies and experience other dimensions. The journey might also be spiritually purifying, and ingesting these entheogenic plants, in other words, plants that, you know, increase your awareness of the divine in yourself, might be accompanied by excessive vomiting. Sorry, and don't even try it, but hopefully lead to enlightenment and improvement in character, so they would say. Fasting for 4 days, however, without water is how a preferred way for Algonquins to seek visions today, and it's a lot less dangerous. However, it's interesting. There is a clear cultural association between vision quest sites and certain trees or plants whose fruit can be used as a hallucinogen, even though the plant would be rarely, if ever, used for that purpose. So the plant is said to have the spirit of that tree or bush is thought to hold that spiritual power. So you want to have your vision quest near that plant, even without using it. So the wealth of mulberries on Monument Island suggests it was used as a sacred site for the purpose of spiritual renewal and for vision quest. So that's kind of a surprise. So a little joke here, monument, in a sense, means or implies, get your pemmican right here, because both mulberries and deer were culled here for centuries to make pemmican, even probably by the Revolutionary War soldiers themselves, following native traditions in a pinch because they needed to get through the winter too. And the word monument doesn't say what kind of berries were growing here, but the circumstances suggest it was an advertisement for the pemmican, as they may have so many people in camps making it. Get your pemmican right here. Now, I'm going to go right ahead, and they have other similar treats here. Monument Island is blessed with white and red oak, various kinds of acorns. So it was a peak of acorn production, that's a natural production, around 2500 BC. The ancestors lived largely off of them. They're also high in tannic acid and rather poisonous, so they must be soaked, dried, and soaked again several times, and then pounded into a flour to make bread. But then the Algonquins lived off that. So to know how to prepare acorns without killing yourself is a source of great Algonquin pride today, and actually a regular topic of conversation, which I wrote about in Native New Yorkers, No Word for Time, and Herbs or Verbs. So many Algonquin place names still bear the term sagabun, or ground nuts of the ancestors. Saga meaning ancient, bun meaning falling down, indicating this is where the old ones live, off falling acorns. So that's the way our language works. Sag Harbor, Sagabun, Sagabanak, Sagamanakidi. Many place names are from meaning the place of the ancient ones where they ate acorns. There's some detail about this that is rarely heard. The oak and hickory maximum in the United States, where they were at the greatest number, correlated with a warm, dry period lasting from 2500 BC to 2000 BC. This is also the total time period that Frontenac Island culture was inhabited by the archaic culture so named. So Frontenac Island is an island. It's not terribly near Peebles, but not too far. And it was inhabited by that culture, which was named Frontenac Island culture. And they subsisted significantly on groundnuts. It's also called a river culture, by the way. This led to indirectly to the development of the Susquehanna and then meadowwood cultures, which have passed on memories of these acorn times called the days of our ancestors to our modern day Algonquins. My Micmac name, which is Abak Bahamech, means chipmunk. And so my name is a direct reference to the ancestors who lived by finding fallen acorns and hickories and storing them for the future. So it not only is alive and well in Algonquin culture, but it's my name. Monument Island was most certainly part of that river culture and transition time period, and still boasts many Sagabanak acorns and hickories. So now Ritchie describes Snook Hill culture, which is pre-Susquehanna, just before this Frontenac Lake, Frontenac Island, and during the Oak Hickory maximum. The main sites are just above the floodplain of Catskill Creek, also 100 feet above the Hoosick River as a particular site, and 3 at a tributary running through Rensselaer County. And all 3 are near Monument Island. So this is of national importance of these 3 Snook Hill sites, all right near Peebles Island. And there are oaks and hickories. The 3 carbon dates suggest the first inhabitants arrived 2500 BC. The recent occupants of this phase departed for the last time 500 years later. So he says this estimate places the total period of the island's habitation within the xerothermic interval of maximum warmth and dryness, which has been correlated with the oak hickory forest maximum in the Northeast United States. That's Archaeology of New York State. So what that means is there was an unusual number of acorns and hickories in Eastern US at that time, and those cultures adapted by eating largely those. And so this has come down to us as part of our oral tradition. Ground nuts can be called min. Monument Island, home to black walnuts and 2 hickory trees, and they're all big medicine. And this has been a big year for black walnuts, whose production varies. Their natural production varies quite a lot. And so I said, if you want to, you can take 5 of them in a bag with the husks on and sniff them. And they smell really good. It's kind of a country fresh smell. Just to entertain yourself. And you can step on them to crack the green husks, and then you soak the nuts inside. Now on the right are hickories, so they're also falling in big numbers. I've already taken the husks off. So black walnuts are the only all wild tree nut in the United States with a bold taste. Black walnuts are indigenous to the USA exclusively, this particular kind. Native Americans gone out in groups in the fall every year for millennia to gather them for food. This has been going on thousands of years, especially the first week of October, which it still is. The word in Muncie for walnut is ptuquim, which is ptuk is round, and twim, it means it has a spine. The walnut is round, as are most nuts, but what makes it unique is the spine, which looks like a human spine, but is circular, like the equator around the earth. It goes around the edge of the shell, and when you crack it open, it's the spine that opens up, revealing the meat. The inside is wibunum, twisting and turning inside the shell. Now, according to the doctrine of signatures used by Native Americans, the walnut's good brain food because it looks like a brain when it's shelled whole. But really, it's even more famous as a folk treatment for parasites, worms, and yeast infections. But eating the meat is good for improved cardio health and fighting diabetes, but not as a sole remedy, but as an additive remedy. The tannins is bitter, but it is a strong antioxidant and inflammatory agent. The nuts high in unsaturated fat and protein, and potential against cholesterol, prostate cancer, and more. So there's a mystery species which is antibacterial. But the hickories, Caria tomentosa, they fall the same first week of October. The shagbark variety, which are very common in the Hudson Valley, produces the most nuts, so nationally important, and have more energy per bite than walnuts, and the most caloric content of any wild food in the world. 1 ounce of hickory nut gives you 193 calories. So you can split the green husk with a rock, revealing a tan-colored nut, which you see like a marble. It's possible to eat them raw, but most would want to cook them first. I want to mention to you that the town of Kiskaton, not that far away, takes its name from the Native American word for a special species of the thin-shelled hickory you can open with your teeth. The word for black walnuts and acorns and hickories, the chestnuts, and even the butternut is sagamon or ground nut, as I mentioned. But the word pegank is more specifically associated with hickory trees. Governor's Island was called Pegank Island for a long time and changed to Nut Island. Trees are ancient species, but they take 10 years to produce nuts. And they use the hickory for making bows and arrows, war clubs, walking sticks. And it's also preferred for cultivating honeybees after contact with whites, I believe, but I'm not sure why. So min is reference to wild rice, which is called manomin. So min would be short for that. More of a vegetable than a grain when it's wild, not the same as Asian. And Menominee is out west, but I'll show you a connection in just a minute with Menominees, where the food grows on the water. So in Low Island, which is Roloff's Island here, which is now filled in, there's a channel that could have been used for wild rice. And here's a picture of Ojibwe beating the rice with sticks to make the kernels fall off into the boat. So that could have been used around like in this channel just below Roloff's Island, which is now a part of Peebles Island. So this is likely that this could have happened. It's very possible, but there's no knowledge of it specific. So I wanted to show you this, very interesting. So the sixth island of the Anishinaabe migration, which is the migration of the Seven Fires prophecy, we Dong, now called Spirit Island, which is now also called Duluth, Minnesota, at the west end of Lake Superior, was the place prophesied as where the food grows on the water. In other words, monomen, wild rice. This is the origin of the word Menominee, but it's not in reference to Peebles Island. Islands in this migration play a major role. And the Anishinaabe are, you could call Canadian Algonquins, but somewhere in the US, as part of the Seven Fires prophecy migration. The Mohicans of Peeble Island would have been well aware of this prophecy and this migration, and most likely some participated. This map is from the Mishomis book, The Voice of the Ojibwe, by the late Edward Benton Benes. Something to study at length, but it's all about islands. And here's Peebles Island. So Monument Island, an ideal spot for fishing, near the mouth of several rivers used as portage routes. The Erie Canal, the old Champlain Canalway, and the McDonald Creek all go through Waterford, and they're all remnants of ancient portage routes leading to Monument and to the Hudson. And the Champlain Canalway connects with the Deep Kill Creek on the eastern bank of the Hudson. If you go to the end of Champlain, you take a right, cross the Hudson, and then you're in Deep Kill, which is also a very important portage route crossing over eastward. Now let's talk briefly about the sycamores. The sycamore stands on Peebles Island, estimated to be 240 years old. It means it was taking root around 1776. That was the same year that Daniel Boone rescued 3 young women from Shawnee raiders at Sycamore Hollow, Kentucky. They'd been paddling a sycamore dugout canoe when they were captured. Most sycamores develop hollows or holes after a few years, and some are large enough to camp out in. Algonquin hunters would sleep comfortably in them during rainy nights. Others would make them into dugout canoes 60 feet long or so, maybe longer, placing a seat in the horizontal hollow. Now, this is a picture of a similarly old sycamore, but this one is the Pinchot sycamore in Connecticut. But the fact that a sycamore exists on the island of that age shows that there must have been others, and that the ancestors would have used them for quick hunting lodges. So you see on the right, you see how a sycamore could be an ideal lodge to be very comfortable as a wigwam. And here you see an etching of the 3 girls, the capture of Jemima Boone and Betsy and Fanny Calloway, very famous in frontier lore, captured by Shawnee Indians near Sycamore Hollow in the Kentucky River, and they were later rescued by Daniel Boone. And so it's part of that same exact time period. So this is just more of a regular canoe that's not a dugout. This is the birch bark used for portage. It's the only kind you can use for portage. There's sycamore balls, and there's a sycamore tree from the area. Wigwams, really briefly, plenty of saplings on the island, and so there could have been many dozens of wigwams or wickiups, and no trace would remain. There's no post holes. They go up in 4 hours, and taken down even faster, so you wouldn't know. But much of Algonquin culture is designed to leave no trace upon the earth. Now, left is the Northeast Algonquin star aperture. I made this wigwam myself and made it so you can see the six-pointed star at the top. That's a thousands of year old design of the Eastern Woodlands. It's a very solid construction. Here is a less solid construction, and this is Dom Deedham, a Micmac, overseeing making this larger, flatter crosswords wigwam. There are very many styles. Here's one the students are making. Here's another one. And here's another one here, another kind. That's a Ashokan. And there's another one, Connecticut. And this is the teepee-like kind up in Nova Scotia. And this one is in Patterson. You would take the elm bark, flatten it on a stream bed, and lay stones all over it for 2 or 3 weeks. And then they'd put it on like almost like plywood. And there's the wigwam of Kejima Ujik style up in Nova Scotia. No real aperture, but the smoke rises with a small hole. And I believe it predates the Lakota teepee. Now, just to complete the program, this is a doll that I helped to make, working with Iroquois Mexicano, whose picture you saw. I was able to help the Smithsonian create a young Mohican girl doll, circa 1630, to correct a less accurate one. They had prototyped for display. They were in progress, and they're very open to the advice of me and Iroquois. And so this is what we came up with, and it was well received by traditionalists and historians, this doll. And so you see all these are, I know she looks a little Barbie-esque, but all the clothing is definitely the kind you realistically see a Mohican woman wearing, either today traditionally or in those days. Now this water basket, which is made by Jennifer Lee, is just one example I grabbed to show you some of the sophisticated basketry they made. It holds water without leaking. You can drop a hot stone in it when it's full of soup, and the soup will cook quickly. I've done it. It's amazing. Okay, and just real quick, there's this cooking vessels in New York. This chart emphasizes Iroquois naming for the ceramic traditions, but they're very, very similar. They both emerged out of Vinette. This is Vinette. And from here, like they were all very consistent, very similar. And so when I said this Muncie pots come out, here's the Muncie in size down in the bottom, and they're late. And this comes out of this whole similar group here. It's Algonquin. And there's just a few artifacts, pouch, moccasins, sweetgrass, very important. And here's a fishing weir, but probably was somewhere similar one in the Mohawk River. So that's the end of my show, and I'm going to stop sharing here. And I hope we still have a few people with us. So thank you for watching. I'm still recording. And so I guess you want, David, you want me to?
Hi, Evan.
Do anything?
Nope, we're good. We have a couple of questions. If anybody has any questions, please type them into the chat window. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a little word chat. If you click on that, the chat window will open up and you can just type your message and hit enter. Our first question, Evan, is from Judith. And you talked early about all the movement of the Native people in the early 1600s, how they were all moving around all the different parts of the area. What was causing all that movement at that period of time?
Well, remember that the Mohicans named themselves after the river that is constantly in motion. And so it became sort of an identity thing, like this was who we are. We are the people that are constantly in motion, like this river. They really kind of stuck around where Castleton and Skodak Island, that was relatively permanent, but overall they just, they would wear out the land. Like if you have 20 years planting corn in one place, then you have to move. And the Haudenosaunee did the same thing. They'd stay farming in one place for only 20 years, at the maximum maybe 23 years. And then there's depletion of the nutrition, so you move to let the soil go fallow. On the other hand, I have to admit that after 1609, you had tremendous pressure on all sides. So the Dutch had a fort that they built right near Albany, as you know, and you know the name. Anyway, I'll get to it. But they were creating some disturbance. Plus that made the differences with the Haudenosaunee a little more intense. And then the Beaver Wars, about that, the end of that same time, caused everybody to move. That was very disruptive. The Beaver Wars, were, they were French, Dutch, Haudenosaunee, and Mohicans all kind of getting into it and vying for control over the beaver industry. So that was one of the main factors.
Okay, great. I have a question for you. I have a couple other questions here, but a number of early Dutch pipes, the smoking pipes, have been found around Peebles Island and actually up and down along the Hudson River.
Right.
And you mentioned that I think it was the metalwood culture that initially developed the pipes. How did the Dutch pick that up from them? How did the Dutch pick up those early pipes or learn how to develop those early pipes?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And a number of years ago, I went and asked, anybody that I could, had researched this, what the true answer was. And the answer was yes, that they had entirely took them from the native idea. Now, one thing you have to understand is that it goes back to Virginia, that, the very famous explorer who was friends with the Queen. Help me out, David. I'm just bringing his name. But anyway, the sort of consort and advisor to the Queen. So he came over and he found some of these pipes, and he brought back a whole lot of them to England, various kinds of these elbow pipes, which are the ones with the bowl. Right. And so that's early 1500s. And so then by the 1600s, when there's actual colonies, it's already a known quantity in Europe. And so when they come back to the native world, they're more familiar and they're already somewhat fashionable. So what happened was, in these early days, that the Queen and her assistants everything they did would make something fashionable. So the beaver hats that were made through Native American help, and the pipes and the pearls, for example, that she wore were from the New World, from the American coast. And whenever she wore something, it became highly fashionable. So the pipe was the male version of the pearl necklace.
Oh, interesting. So I think down in Lois, or right here, that was probably Walter Raleigh.
Yes, thank you. I could not say it's such an easy question. Thank you, but you deserve extra credit for remembering Walter Raleigh. He was the one that was very close to the Queen, and he was very fashionable, and he brought back pipes and started smoking them, and everybody went nuts over that and wanted to have one, and that started the whole ball rolling.
Okay, we have a couple of references to the word castle. You noted on some of the maps that the word castle was used. Chris wanted to know, what did castle mean at that time period?
Okay, well, they're sort of like the castles in Europe, and they're sort of not. So what it was, I showed you the drawing, of Ringelmann's castle, and the one here and Peebles must have looked pretty much the same. It's a circular group of these cedar poles that had pointed. What I didn't mention is that they would carve the endings so they were very sharp at the bottom. You don't see that, but they hammer them into the ground at berms, which are piled up. Like when you make a sandcastle and you stick a flag in, you pat the sand around it. Only here they were doing it with soil and rocks. And so they'd make a big berm, and they would stick these giant poles in. Some of them, well, I think 16 feet, but apparently some were as large as 30 feet. And so there's two different ways to do that. One was just have a gate at the front with a sign over it, if it's friendly. But in other cases, they were like a big spiral, where the front and end of the walls actually overlapped, so you could sneak in and walk through that little hallway. And so they were hard to to attack the people inside, because of the tall wall. So that's what they call the castle. And so the leader was inside the castle, and he was a chief, but not a king. And then there would be, just as some castles, there'd be a village outside and a very small number of dwellings inside. So it's very much in that sense like a castle in old Europe.
Oh, great. So Rob wants to know if the village of Castleton, that's name is related at all to these floating castles. Do you happen to know?
Oh, well, famously, yeah, Castleton is famous for that. That was, it's funny. And when I go through Castleton, I see people that I think look Mohican, and I just have this habit of not running up and grabbing them and saying, "You're Mohican, darn it," because that sometimes gets into trouble, maybe not so welcome. But yes, Castleton was an area where one of the villages was, because, the islands often were inundated in various seasons, like in the spring. So they couldn't be used all year round, and they couldn't be used for villages all year round. So the villages would be on the shoreline, such as at Castleton. So that's well named.
Okay, great. I think this is probably Carlos has asked this question, and it relates to the mulberry trees and whether or not they might be considered protected on Peebles Island.
Oh, I'm not sure what the question means, but they're not protected now.
Yeah, they're not a protected tree, I don't think.
No, the point is, you're probably wondering why I spent so much time talking about mulberries. This is outside of Algonquin culture. This is hardly known. The general mainstream culture knows nothing about the medicine of mulberry trees. And frankly, as I tried to jokingly tell in the story, that, I didn't really think of the mulberries as medicine berries. And I was walking on the island with a medicine person whose picture you saw, believe it or not. And, I had a lot to learn, because obviously I had 3 or 4 teachers come to my aid immediately, elders, also people with PhDs in botany, etc., all saying mulberries are medicine. They're very serious medicine, and they use them to help heal any digestive illnesses. So they're not that rare. So, one thing about protection, they're not rare enough to be a priority to protect. But yeah, we should protect them if there are dangers. And the ones, there was a lot of them on this island, and they are already protected a little bit by the island. So it's an interesting thought, but I don't think they're endangered.
Okay. You mentioned the early use of copper, and we have a question from Paul about, do you know how it was actually discovered and to what use they put copper?
Yes, I've studied that. Okay, let's talk about in the upper Ottawa River Valley, that an isolated area past Morrison's Island, including Morrison's Island, which you should definitely read about. And Alumet Island was even more intensely occupied by early Algonquins, whereas they developed, the linguistics, and they found copper at this western end of Lake Superior, where you saw Duluth on the map, Spirit Island, which is the 6th island of the 7 Fires migration. And I've seen it. I went out there. There's copper just like on the seashore in big boulders, and it's green, so you don't think anything about it. But if you polish it, it turns copper colored. And so they could kind of hammer it off without special tools, and then hammer that, sometimes using heat, sometimes not. And I have a whole PowerPoint about the beautiful, incredibly beautiful work that they did, different tools and different sculptures that are breathtaking. And I think much better than what Egypt did with copper 1,000 years later. So at the time they were doing this, 4,000 BC in this region, they were doing things that no one in the world had done. And so they had this advanced culture worldwide, on a worldwide scale, for just a while, but they remained isolated. They traded, by the way, they were trading with the Adena culture as a kind of the power partner. And then Adena outshone them with their treasures over centuries. It's a fascinating story.
That's great. We have more of a comment from Carol. Carol apparently at one time thought about growing a tobacco plant, and was apparently informed that it's controlled and illegal to grow tobacco. I didn't know that. I don't know if anybody else knows anything more about that, but apparently you can't grow tobacco.
I don't know about it. I never heard that.
Never, I haven't heard that either. That's all the questions we have in here. Just to wrap up, Evan, the one thing we didn't discuss, and a lot of people hear about it, is the significance of Cohoes Falls, which is not too far from Peebles Island, and the number of Native peoples who met at the actual Cohoes Falls and some events at Cohoes Falls. Could you mention that a little bit, and the meetings that took place at Cohoes Falls among some of the Native peoples?
Yes, I mean, for what I remember, this is from years ago, there was a place to the north of Cohoes Falls where the peacemaker actually met with the leaders of the Mohawk, and the war chiefs I mentioned and the other Mohawk leaders. And it seems to me there was an elementary school somewhere within a half mile, and maybe that school's not there anymore. But these were very significant meetings in terms of world history, because of course, when the Mohawks finally, they were the last holdouts other than Tandaho. But when they agreed that based on his passing the test at Cohoes Falls, that they were going to go along with this vast plan of a union of 5 tribes with the Tanadaho in charge of it, then, that was a switching point in world history, because, that, of course, Benjamin Franklin and the Treaty of Albany ran into a Haudenosaunee chief who told him the whole story, and he was very interested, and was thinking, well, if these 5 savage nations can form this perfect union, why can't we? And so he shamed the other colonists into joining into this constitutional union. And so you got to look back at the peacemaker and at these Mohawks for having the foresight, to embrace this kind of democratic way of life. And the great law itself is a way of resolving conflicts that is still used. And one of the important things, it says each of you have 7 layers of skin, each one as thick as your thumb. And I traveled with Jake Edwards and many other people during the Turo Wampum campaign, and of course there were a lot of bumping heads. And I said to him jokingly, I said, Jake, I'm having trouble. I only have 6 layers of skin, to see what he'd say, right? Because I was like, geez, this is hard. He said, oh, Evan, you got to have 7 layers. Just got to have 7. And that was, he knew what I meant. And it's a part of the great law about how to be a peacemaker. You just can't react to everybody's crap. You just have to take it and keep your eyes on the prize, so to speak. So I've lived part of that, and I'm not Haudenosaunee, but I learn a whole lot from certain people like Tom Porter and others.
Great. I think that's it. I think we've covered all the questions that people have put in the chat. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you, Evan, very much for a very informative and educational talk.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it, and I hope to see this. I guess I'm the one with the recording, right? But you'll make a link of some kind and put it somewhere in your archives, right?
Yes, and what we'll do is once we get the recording, we'll put it on the Friends of Peebles Island website so that everybody can view it, and I'll let everybody know when that's available out there. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I will also email everyone the contact information for the 2 organizations that sponsored tonight, and Evan's contact information also.
Great.
So thank you, everyone.
Go for it.
Thanks for joining us this evening.
Well, you're welcome. It was a lot of fun, very challenging and very rewarding at the same time. Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.